They hurt you. And you said nothing. Not because you had nothing to say. Not because you were weak. Not because you did not feel it, you felt every bit of it. But because somewhere deep inside you, something understood what most people spend a lifetime never learning. That your silence was not emptiness. It was weight. It was the heaviest, most unnerving, most powerful response you could have given. Because the person who hurt you was waiting, counting on your reaction. They needed it. They built the entire moment around the assumption that you would give it to them. And you didn't. And now they don't know what to do with themselves. This is not a script about becoming cold. It is not about becoming distant or untouchable or above human feeling. It is about something far more sophisticated than any of that. It is about the Stoic understanding of power, real power, the kind that does not require an audience, does not need to perform itself, does not beg the other person to acknowledge it. The power that lives entirely inside you, that no one gave you and therefore no one can take, the power of choosing, in the moment of greatest provocation, not to react. That choice, that one choice, made in the silence of a breath, is the most stoic thing a human being can do. And it changes everything. Point 1. Reaction is what they are counting on, and withholding it is the whole game. Every person who has ever tried to hurt you, provoke you, diminish you, or destabilize you had one thing in mind when they did it. Your reaction. Not the action itself. The action is just a mechanism. The goal was always the reaction. The flinch. The outburst. The visible wound. The evidence that they got to you. That you could be moved. That you could be controlled. That their words or actions had the power to determine your inner state. Because that is what reaction gives the provocateur, proof of power. Proof that they matter enough to you that you cannot hold yourself together in their presence. Proof that they have found the lever. And once they know where the lever is, they will use it again and again and again. The Stoics understood this dynamic with remarkable clarity. Epictetus, who spent years as a slave, surrounded by people who had every external form of power over him, identified something they could not touch. He called it the prohairesis, the faculty of choice. The inner citadel. The part of him that decided how he experienced what happened to him, regardless of what happened to him. His master could hurt his body. His master could not touch his response. And the moment Epictetus understood that, truly understood it, in his bones, not just as an idea, the dynamic shifted. Because a person you cannot provoke is a person you cannot control. And a person you cannot control has a kind of freedom that chains and ownership can never reach. Let me tell you about a woman named Ngozi. Ngozi worked in an office with a colleague, let's call him Raymond, who had decided, for reasons Ngozi never fully understood, that she was a target. He undermined her in meetings. He took credit for ideas she had shared with him privately. He made small comments carefully calibrated, always deniable, that were designed to make her doubt herself, to make others see her as less capable, less confident, less worthy of the position she held. For the first year, Ngozi reacted. Not dramatically, she was a professional. But visibly. She got flustered in the meetings where he interrupted her. She defended herself against the small comments. She went home and spent hours replaying what had happened, constructing better responses, imagining the conversation where she finally said the thing that put him in his place. Raymond kept going. Because she kept reacting. And every reaction was confirmation that he had found the lever. Then Ngozi read something that changed everything. A line from Epictetus. If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. She sat with that for a long time. She did not like it because it felt like it was blaming her for what Raymond was doing. But slowly she understood what it actually meant. Not that Raymond was not responsible for his behavior, but that she had been handing him his power. Her reactions were his fuel. Without them, he had nothing. She stopped reacting. Not immediately. The first few times required enormous internal effort that probably showed on her face in ways she could not fully control. But she stopped giving him the visible, external reaction he was engineering for. When he interrupted her, she paused, looked at him calmly, and continued speaking without acknowledging the interruption. When he took credit for her ideas, she documented and let the documentation speak. When he made the small deniable comments, she let them land in a silence so complete that they seemed to fall at his feet and belong to him. Raymond escalated at first, as provocateurs always do when the expected reaction does not come. He pushed harder, found new angles, tried new approaches. Ngozi noticed this and understood it as confirmation that she was on the right path. The escalation was not evidence that she should react. It was evidence that her non-reaction was working. Within 3 months, Raymond had moved his attention entirely to someone else. Not because he had reformed. Because Ngozi was no longer producing the reaction that made the effort worthwhile. When you withhold the reaction, you do not just protect yourself in the moment. You fundamentally alter the dynamic. You change what you are to the person trying to provoke you, from a source of the power they were seeking to a wall that their efforts simply do not penetrate. And walls are not interesting targets. Walls do not give you what you came for. Understand this. Every provocation is a question. It is asking, "Can I move you?" Your reaction is a yes. Your silence is a no. And the no, delivered with composure and without drama, is the most powerful answer in the world. Point 2. The body wants to react. Training it not to is the work of a lifetime. Here is something the Stoics were honest about that modern self-help often glosses over. Not reacting is hard. It is not a decision you make once. It is a decision you make again and again, in real time, under real pressure, with your nervous system doing everything it was biologically designed to do to make you react. Because the body is not neutral in this. When someone hurts you, provokes you, or threatens your sense of self, the body responds before the mind has finished processing what happened. Cortisol spikes. Heart rate increases. The jaw tightens. The hands clench or go cold. The face does things you did not tell it to do. The voice, if you speak, carries the tremor of what you are feeling even when the words are controlled. This is not weakness. This is the human body doing exactly what millions of years of evolution designed it to do: prepare you to respond to a threat. The Stoics did not pretend this wasn't happening. They did not claim to be exempt from it. What they claimed was something different and far more achievable: that the physiological response and the outward behavior do not have to be the same thing. You can feel every bit of the reaction happening inside you, and still choose what you do with it on the outside. That gap between what the body does automatically and what the person chooses to do deliberately is where all the power lives. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this gap constantly. He was dealing with people who were trying to manage him, manipulate him, provoke him into decisions that served their interests rather than the empire's. He was an emperor, which meant the stakes of his reactions were civilizational. He could not afford to let someone else's provocation determine his policy. So he trained. Every morning, he wrote to himself about the likely provocations of the day ahead and how he intended to meet them. He essentially pre-decided his non-reaction before the situation arose. So that when the moment came, he was not deciding in the heat of it. He was executing a decision already made in the cool of the morning. Here is the story. There was a man named Taiwo who was, by his own admission, someone who had always reacted quickly and visibly to almost everything. It was not a character flaw exactly. It was just the way he had always been. Expressive. Immediate. His feelings lived close to the surface and moved directly to his face and voice without much delay. This had been mostly fine until he moved into a leadership role where his reactions carried weight. Where a visible frustration in a meeting changed the dynamic of the room. Where a flash of anger, even a small one, even a justified one, became the thing people remembered and discussed, and used to form opinions about his fitness for the role. He started working on the gap. Not on suppressing what he felt. He had tried that, and it produced a different but equally readable tension. He worked on the space between feeling and expression. On breathing. On the physical practice of stillness. Keeping the face neutral, keeping the hands still, keeping the voice at the same register when something landed hard as when something landed softly. He started small. Practiced in low-stakes situations. Deliberately maintained composure in small moments of frustration so that when the large moments came, The muscle had been built. It took over a year of consistent effort before he felt like he had genuine access to the gap in real time. And in that year, there were many moments where he did not manage it, where the body won and the reaction came before the choice could catch it. He did not despair about those moments. He studied them. He noticed what the physical warning signs were, the specific sensation in his chest, the particular tightening in his shoulders, so that next time, he could use those sensations as the signal to deploy the practice rather than the accelerant of the reaction. The training is not a one-time decision. It is what the Stoics would have called ascesis, discipline practice. A daily, incremental, imperfect, absolutely essential building of the capacity to choose your response rather than be ambushed by it. Start small. Practice in the low-stakes moments. Build the gap between stimulus and response one breath at a time. And understand that every time you successfully hold the space, even for a moment longer than you held it last time, you are building something that no one outside of you can see and no one outside of you can take. Point 3. Silence after being hurt is not suppression, it is sovereignty. There is a version of silence that is toxic. That is the silence of suppression, the emotion driven underground, forced down, denied, left unprocessed, where it ferments into something that emerges later in ways that cause more damage than the original reaction would have. The Stoics were not teaching that silence. They were very clear about this distinction, and it matters enormously. Stoic silence after being hurt is not the silence of denial. It is the silence of sovereignty. It is the decision made from a place of clarity rather than repression that this moment, this person, this provocation does not deserve the gift of your interior life performed for their viewing. That what you feel is real and yours and will be processed in your own time, in your own way, in the privacy that genuine emotional life deserves. But that the reaction, the public performance of the wound is not something you are obligated to provide. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." The reaction, the outburst, the visible wound, the defensive speech is almost always driven more by the story the mind is creating about what happened than by what actually happened. The insult lands. The mind immediately begins constructing a narrative, what it means, what it says about you, what it says about them, what they are going to say next, what everyone watching is thinking. And the reaction comes from that story more than from the original event. Sovereign silence interrupts the story. It says, I am not going to perform this narrative for anyone. I am going to feel what I feel privately, examine it honestly, and decide, not react, what this means and what, if anything, I will do about it. Here is the story. There was a woman named Amaka who was publicly criticized at a professional conference. Not the constructive kind of criticism that sharpens thinking, but the kind designed to make the person on the receiving end look small. A senior figure in her field stood up during a Q&A and questioned her methodology in terms that were just slightly too dismissive to be neutral. The room turned to watch how she would respond. Amaka felt it. All of it. The heat in her face. The tightening in her chest. The flooding of her mind with responses, some measured, some not. The deep, immediate wish to defend herself in terms so precise and so devastating that no one in the room would ever question her competence again. She took one breath. And then she said calmly and evenly, "That is an interesting perspective. I will think carefully about it," and moved on. The room, which had been waiting for conflict, deflated into something more interesting, the quiet authority of a woman who could not be rattled. Several people came to her afterward, not to discuss the criticism, but to tell her they had been impressed by how she had handled it. The senior figure who had criticized her never did so publicly again. Not because Amaka had defeated him in the moment. Because she had denied him the scene he was setting up. She had taken the stage he had built for himself and quietly folded it up. That evening, alone, Amaka processed the full range of what she had felt. She let herself be angry. She examined whether there was any legitimate point in the criticism. There was a small one, and she noted it. She let the rest dissolve. Not suppressed. Processed. Released. In private, where it belonged. The difference between suppression and sovereignty is this. Suppression pushes the feeling down and walks away still carrying it. Sovereignty holds the feeling privately, processes it honestly, and walks away having actually released it. The public silence in the moment is not the end of the emotional experience. It is the beginning of the private one, which is where real emotional intelligence actually lives. Point 4. The person who needs you to react is telling you everything about themselves. Pay attention to this one, because it is the shift in perspective that changes everything. When someone works to provoke you, when they push your buttons, make the cutting comment, deliver the carefully aimed insult, or create the situation designed to force a reaction, they are not demonstrating their power over you. They are demonstrating their need for you. Think about what provocation actually requires. It requires that the other person matter enough to you for their action to affect you. It requires that you care enough about their opinion, their assessment, their presence, their approval or disapproval to react to what they do. It requires, in other words, that you have given them enough of your inner life that they have something to work with. But here is the other side of that coin, which the Stoics saw with total clarity. The person who needs to provoke you is the one who needs something from you. They need your reaction to feel powerful. They need your wound to feel effective. They need your destabilization to feel stable. They are, in the most fundamental sense, dependent on you, on your reaction, in a way that you are not dependent on them. Epictetus saw this in his own situation. His master needed his slaves to react, needed the visible proof of power that reaction provides, far more than Epictetus needed anything from his master. The moment Epictetus understood this, the power dynamic inverted in the only place that actually mattered, inside his own mind. Here is the story. There was a man named Chitty who had a family member, a cousin, who had spent years making comments designed to diminish him. The cousin's comments were always dressed as jokes, always delivered in company, always followed by laughter that made responding seem like an overreaction. Chitty, always the serious one. Oh, Chitty and his big ideas. We will see if that works out, huh, Chitty? For years, Chitty had burned quietly at family gatherings. He had gone home and replayed the comments. He had fantasized about responses, the perfect comeback, the moment where he finally said the thing that shut it down permanently. He never said any of them. Partly because the timing was never right. Partly because responding at all felt like elevating the comments to a status they did not deserve. And then he started actually looking at the cousin not as someone with power over him, but as someone who needed the dynamic to feel okay about himself. Because every time Chitty did something new, something significant, the cousin's first move was to diminish it. Not to ask about it. Not to engage with it. To immediately reach for the mechanism that put Chitty slightly below him in the room. What did that tell Chitty about his cousin? It told him that his cousin needed him smaller in order to feel okay at his own size. That the comments were not evidence of Chitty's inadequacy. They were evidence of the cousin's anxiety, about his own choices, his own trajectory, the comparison that Chitty's progress implied. Chitty did not feel contempt at this realization. He felt something stranger and more useful, a kind of clarity. He stopped taking the bait not because he had trained himself not to, but because he genuinely stopped feeling provoked. Because the person doing the provoking had revealed themselves. And it was hard to be destabilized by someone you now understood was destabilized themselves. When someone works to provoke you, ask yourself, what does this behavior tell me about what they need? Because the person who is secure, who is genuinely at peace with themselves and their life, has no need to diminish you. No need for your reaction. No need to prove anything at your expense. The provocateur is always showing you their wound, not yours. Point 5. React to nothing immediately. The Stoic rule of the pause that changes every outcome. There is one practice so simple that it fits in a single breath. And so powerful that it would change the trajectory of most people's worst moments if they could just remember to use it. The pause. Not a long pause. Not a theatrical pause designed to signal that you are composing yourself, that just announces the effort. A genuine, internal pause. The moment, lasting anywhere from 1 breath to 10, between what hits you and what you do next. The Stoics did not call it a pause. They called it the discipline of assent, the practice of refusing to automatically agree with the first impression that arrives. Of inserting, between what happens and what you make of it, the brief but critical intervention of your own reasoning faculty. Epictetus taught, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. First, in the space before you act, decide who you are in this moment. Then act from that decision, not from the automatic firing of whatever the moment triggered." That is the pause. The brief, sovereign moment of self-determination between what happens and who you are in response to it. Here is the story. There was a woman named Obiagili, Obi to everyone who knew her, who was, professionally, a negotiator. She worked in high-stakes commercial negotiations where the other parties were often deliberately provocative, using tension, insult, and destabilization as strategy. The ability to receive a deliberately offensive offer or a casually disrespectful comment without reacting was, literally, part of her professional skill set. But it was a skill she had developed through failure first. Early in her career, she had sat across a table from a man who had made an offer so insulting, so far below what the situation warranted, that she had reacted immediately and visibly. Her face had done something. Her voice had changed register. She had said things that were professionally correct but emotionally readable. And the man across the table had seen every bit of it, and had used what he saw for the rest of the negotiation. She went home that evening and understood that she had handed him a roadmap to her interior. She had shown him what moved her, and he had driven directly to it and built his strategy around it. She spent the next year practicing the pause in every context she could find, not just professional but personal. When something landed hard in a conversation, she practiced the breath, the stillness, the moment of internal assessment before response. Not to be cold, not to be difficult, but to build the muscle of choosing her response rather than having it chosen for her by the intensity of the moment. 3 years later, she sat across another table from another man with another deliberately insulting offer. He watched her face as he made it. He was looking for the flinch. Nothing moved. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, in a voice at exactly the same temperature it had been all morning, "Let us talk about what a serious offer would look like." The pause had become so natural, so built into her way of meeting difficult moments, that it no longer felt like effort. It felt like herself. Practice the pause. Not in the moments when you need it most. You will not have access to it then if you have not built it in the moments when you need it less. Practice it in the small daily friction of ordinary life. The slow driver. The dismissive email. The comment that lands wrong. Build the pause there, in the small places, so that when the large moment comes, it is already who you are. Point 6. Your composure is not for them, it is for you. Here is the misunderstanding that keeps people from committing fully to this practice. They think composure under provocation is a strategy for dealing with other people. A tactic. A way of handling them. And so they try to maintain composure while secretly burning, performing calm on the outside while churning with everything they are not showing on the inside. That is not composure. That is suppression wearing composure's clothes. Genuine Stoic composure is not for the person across from you. It is not a strategy for how you appear to them. It is the internal state of a person who has actually through genuine practice and genuine philosophy arrived at a place of equanimity. A place where the provocation lands but does not penetrate. Where the hurt is felt but does not govern. Where the anger rises but does not rule. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. The untroubled spirit is not performed. It is built. It is the result of actually knowing not just intellectually but in a lived experience of daily practice, that the opinion of the person trying to hurt you is an external thing. Something that happens outside the walls of the inner citadel. And the inner citadel does not fall to things that happen outside it. Let me tell you about a man named Nana. Nana had a difficult divorce, the kind where the person who had once known him best used that knowledge to aim precisely at the places most likely to wound. His ex-wife, in the legal proceedings and in social contexts they still shared, said things that were calibrated to hurt him in the deepest ways she knew how. He sat in his therapist's office one afternoon and said, "I am trying so hard not to react in front of her. And I can hold it together when she is there. But the moment I am alone, everything falls apart. His therapist said, "That tells me you are performing composure for her rather than building it for yourself. Composure for an audience is exhausting. Composure as your actual state, that is what you are working toward." That distinction landed. Nana shifted his practice. Instead of white-knuckling his way through encounters with his ex-wife and then collapsing privately, he began working on his actual internal state. The real one, not the performed version. He began sitting with the genuine feelings in the quiet and processing them fully rather than suppressing them to perform later. He began building the philosophical understanding that her words, however precisely aimed, were landing on a version of him that he was choosing, not a fixed target she could always find. Over time, not quickly, but genuinely, he arrived at something different. He stopped needing to perform composure because the composure had become real. Not because he no longer felt anything when she spoke, but because what she said was no longer touching the part of him that governed who he was. Build your composure for yourself. Not as a performance of strength, but as the actual lived reality of a person who has done the internal work. That version of composure, the real one, not the performed one, is the one that actually cannot be penetrated. And it is the one that genuinely changes the dynamic. Not because you are managing the other person, because you have stopped being manageable by them. Point 7. The highest response to cruelty is to refuse to become it. When someone hurts you, really hurts you, the kind of hurt that cuts deep and leaves a mark, there is a part of you that wants to return the favor. Not just to protect yourself, but to make them feel what you feel. To make the pain they caused land somewhere on them the way it landed on you. The Stoics understood this impulse completely. They did not condemn it as shameful. They named it as human, as real, as natural. And then they explained, with absolute precision, why acting on it is always a loss. Not because cruelty does not deserve a response, but because the response of becoming cruel is not a victory over what was done to you. It is the completion of it. It is the moment when the person who hurt you succeeded in their deepest purpose, not just hurting you in a moment, but changing who you are permanently. Making you someone who responds to pain by causing pain. Making you someone who, in trying to wound them, wounded yourself far more profoundly than they ever could have. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Not to punish them for what they did. Not to retaliate with equal or greater force. To simply, in your actual character, in the way you continue to live and move and behave, be the evidence that what they did not make you like them." That is the response. Not a speech. Not a counterattack. The evidence of your life, lived well, in a way that refuses to carry their damage forward. Here is the story. There was a woman named Iphioma who had been betrayed by a close friend, someone she had trusted with things she had never shared with anyone else, and who had used those things against her in a way that caused real and lasting damage to her professional reputation. The betrayal was devastating. And when Iphioma understood its full scope, who had been told what, and how the information had been used, she felt a rage so clean and so total that it frightened her with its clarity. She had access to information that could have destroyed her former friend. Not information she had gathered in preparation for retaliation, just things she knew, from years of genuine closeness, that the friend would not want the world to know. The symmetry was almost too neat. She could end the friendship the way the friendship had ended her reputation. She sat with that option for a long time. She was honest with herself that she wanted it. She did not pretend otherwise. And then she asked herself a question she had read somewhere in Stoic philosophy. Who do you want to be at the end of this? Not, what does she deserve? Not, what would be fair? Not, what would make the pain stop? Who do you want to be at the end of this? She wanted to be someone who had been genuinely betrayed and had not become a betrayer. Someone who had been hurt at the level of her deepest trust and had not destroyed the capacity for trust in herself or others. Someone who had been made to feel that her inner life was a weapon to be used against her, and had responded by protecting her inner life more carefully, not by weaponizing someone else's. She said nothing. She disclosed nothing. She withdrew from the friendship completely and finally. And she built, in the years that followed, a reputation that made the damage of the betrayal irrelevant, not by fighting it but by simply outgrowing the context in which it had mattered. The former friend remained exactly where she had been. And Iphioma moved so far forward that looking back became something she genuinely did not have time for. Refuse to become the thing that hurt you. Not because they deserve your restraint. Because you deserve to remain yourself. Point 8. No reaction also means no explanation. Stop justifying your boundaries to people who will not respect them. There is a specific exhaustion that belongs to people who have been spending their energy trying to get difficult people to understand and accept their limits. They explain why they need what they need. They justify why they are setting the boundary they are setting. They present evidence, history, context, reasoning, because they believe that if they can just explain it clearly enough, the person will finally get it and the boundary will finally be respected. The Stoics would ask a clarifying question: does this person actually not understand? Or do they understand completely and simply not care? Because those require very different responses. Someone who genuinely does not understand your limits needs explanation. Someone who understands them and disregards them anyway does not need a better explanation, they need to encounter a consequence. And the most powerful consequence a Stoic can deploy is not drama, not anger, not punishment. It is the removal of access. Quietly. Without announcement. Without the explanation they are using as an opportunity to argue. Seneca said, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." He did not say, spend unlimited energy trying to convince people who are diminishing you to stop. He said, choose your associations with the same deliberateness you bring to everything else. Because who you spend time with is who you are becoming, whether you notice it or not. Here is the story. There was a man named Obina who had spent 2 years setting the same boundary with the same person, a family member who consistently dismissed his time, his work, his schedule, and his clearly communicated needs. Obina would explain, each time the boundary was crossed, why it mattered. He would do so calmly, with specifics, with genuine effort to be understood. The family member would listen, acknowledge, and then, within weeks, do the same thing again. After the 15th or 16th version of the same conversation, Obina understood something that he had been resisting because it was uncomfortable. This was not a communication problem. The family member was not failing to understand him. The family member was understanding him completely, and deciding that Obina's stated needs were less important than their own preferences. More explaining was not going to change that calculation. The calculation was not about information. Obina stopped explaining. The next time the boundary was crossed, he did not have the familiar conversation. He simply, with no announcement, no speech, no farewell declaration, reduced his availability. Fewer visits. Shorter calls. Less access to the parts of his life that the family member was consistently failing to respect. The family member noticed and asked what was wrong. Obina said simply, "Nothing is wrong. This is just the amount of space I have available right now." No accusation. No list of grievances. No final statement designed to make the family member understand what they had done. Just the quiet, total withdrawal of access, which communicated everything that 2 years of explaining had not. Stop justifying your limits to people who have already decided not to respect them. Your limits are not a position paper that requires their agreement before it can take effect. Set them. Enforce them with your behavior rather than your words. And reserve your explanations for the people who are actually trying to understand you, not the ones who are using your explanation as a debate opening. Point 9. The world moves toward the unshakable. Why composure attracts what reaction repels. There is a paradox at the heart of this entire practice. And it is worth naming directly because it runs so counter to what most people intuitively believe. Most people believe that being expressive, reactive, emotional, demonstrative, is what makes them engaging, interesting, attractive to others. That the visible emotion is what creates connection. That people are drawn toward intensity of feeling, and that composure is somehow cold, and therefore off-putting. The Stoics, and the evidence of human experience, suggest the opposite. People are drawn toward composure the way they are drawn toward a still lake rather than a turbulent river. Not because the lake is less interesting. Because it has a quality the river does not, depth. The turbulent river reveals everything on its surface. The still lake invites you to wonder what lives underneath. The person who reacts to everything tells you everything about themselves immediately. Where their insecurities are. What they cannot handle. What buttons to press. What makes them feel small. The reactive person is fully legible in a way that is fundamentally disempowering. The person who does not react, who meets provocation with stillness, whose inner life is not performed for the audience, whose response is always chosen rather than automatic, that person creates something irresistible, mystery. The quality of a depth that has not been fully plumbed. The suggestion of a self so grounded and so settled that the ordinary mechanisms of social pressure simply slide off it. Marcus Aurelius had this quality, and he was Emperor of Rome, which meant people around him were constantly trying to read him, manage him, predict him, manipulate him. His composure was not just a personal virtue. It was a political tool. A person who cannot be read cannot be manipulated. A person who cannot be provoked cannot be controlled through provocation. The unshakable person commands the room not by dominating it but by being the stable point everything else moves around. Here is the story. There was a woman named Chioma who had spent her 20s being what she described as emotionally available in a way that consistently led to her being taken advantage of. She felt things fully and showed what she felt, and people around her, not always with bad intent, used the visibility of her emotional state as a navigation tool. They knew when she was pleased and pushed further. They knew when she was uncomfortable and whether they could push through that too. They knew how to calibrate their behavior toward her because she was giving them perfect real-time feedback on what was working. In her early 30s, through a combination of exhaustion and a friend's recommendation, she began reading Stoic philosophy. And something in the teaching about the inner citadel, the idea that the self could be genuinely sovereign, genuinely not available for manipulation, not because it felt nothing but because it did not perform everything, spoke to something she had been reaching for without having the language. She began practicing composure. Not performance, actual composure. The real work of processing her emotional life privately, developing genuine equanimity rather than the exhausting performance of it, building the inner stability that meant her external presentation was not a live feed of her interior state. The changes in how people related to her were immediate and surprising. The people who had been casually taking from her without noticing suddenly found themselves uncertain. They could not read her as easily. They did not know if what they were doing was landing the way it used to. And in that uncertainty, they became more careful, more considerate, more attentive. The people who were genuinely interested in her, who wanted to know what was actually happening inside her rather than using it as leverage, found her more interesting than before. Because the depth was there. It was real. It was just no longer available as a self-service buffet for whoever wanted access to it. She did not change who she was. She changed what she gave away for free. Composure is magnetic. Not the performance of it, the real thing. People move toward the unshakable because in a world of constant noise and reaction, the person who is genuinely still is the rarest, most compelling thing in the room. Point 10. No reaction is the beginning, not the end. What you build in the silence. We have traveled through all of this. The withholding of reaction, the pause, the sovereignty of silence, the composure that is real rather than performed, the refusal to become what hurt you, the freedom of not explaining your limits to people determined not to respect them. And now we arrive at the most important point of all. No reaction is not the destination. It is the clearing. The space made available by the choice not to spend yourself on reactions that serve no one. Not you, not the situation, not the people who depend on you. It is what you do with that space that determines everything. The Stoics were not teaching restraint as a permanent state of being. They were teaching it as the foundation from which the actual work of life could be built. The energy not spent on reaction is enormous. When you stop replaying the insults, rehearsing the comebacks, burning at the provocations, managing the performance of composure for audiences who are testing you, you discover an extraordinary surplus of energy, attention, and clarity. That surplus is the gift. And what you do with it is the life. Marcus Aurelius used it to govern one of the most complex political entities in human history, and to write the most enduring personal philosophy journal ever produced. Epictetus used it to teach, to think, to build a philosophical legacy that survived slavery and poverty and physical suffering. Seneca used it to write, with a fluency and depth that centuries have not dimmed, about what it means to live well. They were not neutral people. They were not detached from life. They burned for things. They cared about their work, their students, their ideas, the people they loved. The composure was not the absence of passion. It was the container that made the passion sustainable. The thing that ensured the fire burned steadily and long rather than consuming everything quickly and leaving ash. Here is the final story. There was a young man named Emeka who spent the first 25 years of his life reacting to everything. He reacted to criticism by becoming defensive. He reacted to success by becoming arrogant. He reacted to rejection by becoming bitter. He reacted to injustice by becoming consumed. He was, he said later, entirely at the mercy of whatever the last thing was that happened to him. A good day could be ruined by a single bad comment. A successful week could be poisoned by a single setback. He had no stable floor, just the surface of whatever the current moment was producing. At 26, he began studying Stoicism. Not because someone recommended it. He found it by accident, the way people often find the things that change them. He read Epictetus first, then Marcus Aurelius, then Seneca, and he began the slow, imperfect, immensely difficult work of building the gap. The first year was mostly failure. He would remember the practice after the reaction had already come, like arriving at the station 1 minute after the train had left. He was not discouraged. The Stoics themselves had written extensively about failure as the curriculum. He studied his failures the way a craftsman studies a piece that did not come out right, not with self-recrimination but with diagnostic curiosity. By the second year, the gap was beginning to appear. Small pauses where there had been none before. Moments where he caught the reaction coming and chose something different. Situations that had previously derailed him for days that he now moved through in hours. By the fourth year, something had genuinely shifted. He was not the same person. Not because the outside of his life had changed dramatically, though it had, because the choices you make from composure are simply different and better than the choices you make from reaction, and different and better choices produce different and better lives. He was different on the inside. He had a floor now. A stable place to stand regardless of what the current moment was doing. He still felt things, fully, genuinely, with all the aliveness the Stoics never asked anyone to surrender. But he felt them from a place of stability rather than being at their mercy. He was the one feeling them, rather than the feelings having him. He described it once by saying, "I used to be wherever the wind put me. Now I am somewhere specific. And I can feel the wind without being moved by it unless I choose to be." That is the end of this practice. Not a person who feels nothing. A person who is somewhere specific. Who has a self so settled and so real that the provocations and the pains and the petty cruelties and the larger losses, they all arrive and are all genuinely felt, and none of them determine who you are or where you stand. That is the power. Not a reaction. The settled, sovereign, unperformable, unshakable fact of a self that belongs to no one but you. They hurt you. And you said nothing. And in that nothing, in that composed, chosen, deeply intentional silence, you did something remarkable. You refused to let someone else's cruelty become the sentence that defined your paragraph. You refused to let the provocation write your response. You refused to hand over the most precious thing you have, your sovereignty over your own inner state, to a person who did not deserve the gift of your reaction. That is not passivity. That is not weakness. That is not letting them win. That is the most stoic, the most sovereign, the most genuinely powerful thing a human being can do in a moment of pain. And on the other side of that silence, in the space you have protected and reclaimed and refused to fill with noise, there is a life. Your actual life. The one that does not belong to the provocateurs or the betrayers or the people who needed you smaller in order to feel okay at their own size. Build that life. In the quiet. With everything the reactions would have cost you. No reaction. That is your power. And it always was. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their silence is not absence. It is the heaviest thing in the room. Please subscribe for more. The most powerful thing you will ever do is walk away without saying a word. Not in anger. Not in defeat. Not because you lost. But because you finally understood something that took the Stoics centuries to teach and most people a lifetime to learn. That the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who are never going to understand you anyway, the moment you stop fighting for a place that was slowly draining everything out of you, the moment you close the door quietly instead of dramatically, that is the moment your real life begins. Most people let go loudly. They make speeches. They send the final message. They need the other person to know, to understand exactly how much they were wrong, exactly why they are leaving, exactly what they are losing. They need closure from the outside because they have not yet learned to create it on the inside. But there is another way. A quieter way. A way so composed, so grounded, so absolutely certain of itself that it requires no audience, no validation, no final word. The Stoics called it the practice of releasing what is not yours to carry. Of closing chapters with your dignity fully intact. Of starting over not as someone who failed and escaped, but as someone who chose themselves so completely that nothing outside of them could hold them anymore. This is how you take your power back. Not with noise, with silence. And a new beginning that the old version of your life never could have given you. Point 1. Letting go is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength a human being can practice. Everything the modern world tells you about strength is wrong. It tells you that strength means holding on. That commitment means staying regardless of the cost. That walking away is giving up. That the person who endures the most, who tolerates the most, who stays the longest in the hardest situation, that person is the strong one. The Stoics looked at this idea and dismantled it completely. Strength, in the Stoic understanding, is not the capacity to endure anything. It is the wisdom to know what is worth enduring and what is slowly destroying the person you were built to be. It is the courage, and it takes enormous courage to release what no longer serves your growth, your peace, your purpose, even when the world around you is telling you that releasing it means you failed. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with characteristic precision, asterisk. Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. Not, never let go of anything. But, never hold on to anything that costs you your self-respect in the holding. Because a person who has lost their self-respect has nothing. Not really. Let me tell you about a man named Chukwuemeka. Chukwuemeka had spent 11 years in a business partnership that had once been the best decision of his life. In the early years, it was genuine, two men building something together, trusting each other, growing. But over time, slowly and then all at once, the partnership became something else. His partner had become someone who took credit without sharing it, who made decisions that benefited himself at the expense of the business, who had quietly, over years, rearranged the entire structure of what they had built to favor himself. Chukwuemeka stayed. Because he had invested 11 years. Because they had history. Because leaving felt like admitting that 11 years had been wasted. Because people in the industry knew them as a pair, and he was afraid of what leaving would say about him. He stayed until he could barely recognize himself in the mirror. He had become quiet in ways that were not peace, they were suppression. He had become agreeable in ways that were not wisdom, they were defeat. The day he finally left, he said nothing dramatic. He did not make accusations. He did not send a letter cataloging every wrong. He sat across from his partner, said clearly and calmly that he was choosing a different direction, shook his hand, and walked out. People in the industry expected a public collapse. What they got instead was a man who, within 2 years, had built something new that was better in every measurable way. Not despite the leaving. Because of it. The 11 years were not wasted. They were the training ground. The leaving was not failure. It was the moment Chukwuemeka chose himself over the story he had been afraid to change. That is what Stoic strength looks like. Not the gritted teeth of someone enduring the intolerable. The open hands of someone who has understood that some things need to be released in order to become who you were always meant to be. Point 2. Silence is the most dignified exit. Why the final word is never as powerful as the last image you leave. There is a war inside every person who is leaving something or someone. And the war is always about the same thing. Do I say it or do I stay quiet? Do I tell them exactly what they did? Do I make them understand the full weight of what they cost me? Do I get the last word, the real last word, the one that finally makes them see what I see? The Stoics have an answer. And it is the one that is hardest to accept. No. Not because the truth isn't worth speaking. Not because you don't deserve to be understood. But because the final speech, the one people deliver when they are leaving, almost never achieves what they hope it will achieve. The person on the receiving end is not suddenly illuminated. They do not transform in front of your eyes. They defend, deflect, or dismiss. And you walk away having spent your last moments in that chapter in conflict rather than in clarity. Seneca wrote, "True happiness is to enjoy the present, without anxious dependence upon the future, not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient." The final speech is a form of anxious dependence on the future, the hope that if you say exactly the right thing, they will finally give you the closure you have been waiting for. The Stoic truth is that closure is never given. It is only ever built, inside yourself, by yourself, on your own terms. Here is the story. There was a woman named Chidinma who had been in a friendship of 12 years with someone who, she had come to understand, had never fully respected her. The friendship was full of small but consistent patterns. The friend who always needed to be right, who always needed to be the more successful one, who took Chidinma's ideas and presented them as her own, who was only warm when Chidinma was visibly struggling and slightly cold when Chidinma was thriving. For 3 years before she left, Chidinma had been rehearsing the conversation she would have when she finally said enough. She had crafted it, refined it, imagined the friend's face as she heard every carefully chosen word. She was going to make her understand. She was going to finally say all the things she had swallowed for 12 years. And then one morning, she woke up and understood something with a clarity that surprised her. She did not owe that conversation to anyone. The speech she had been rehearsing was not for her friend, it was for herself. And the self it served was the part of her that was still hoping the friend would change, would see, would offer an apology that would finally make the 12 years make sense. That friend was never going to do any of those things. So Chidinma stopped returning calls. Gently at first, then with more distance. No dramatic announcement. No closing speech. Just the quiet withdrawal of her presence and her energy from a place that had never truly valued them. The friend noticed. She reached out. Chidinma responded briefly and kindly and without detail. Eventually, the friendship simply dissolved, not with a bang, not with a scene, but with a silence that said everything that needed to be said without giving anyone anything to argue against. Years later, Chidinma said the thing that surprised her most was how complete she felt about it. She had expected to feel unfinished. Instead, she felt sovereign. Like someone who had made a decision for themselves and executed it without requiring anyone else's permission or understanding. Your silence is not an absence. It is a statement. The most composed, most dignified, most powerful statement a person can make about where they are going and who they are choosing to become. Leave quietly. Let your life be the speech. Point 3. Release the story you've been telling about what happened, because the story is keeping you prisoner. Here is the thing nobody tells you about the things that hurt you. The event ends. The relationship ends. The loss happens. The betrayal occurs. And then the actual thing is over. But the story about the thing? The story can run for years. The replaying of conversations. The re-examination of decisions. The construction of the alternate timeline where you did it differently. Where you said the smarter thing. Where you caught it before it happened. The story that runs on a loop in the quiet moments, in the car, in the space between sleep and waking. That story, which is not the event but your mind's narrative about the event, is where most people actually live when they have been hurt. The Stoics called this fantasia the impression, the mental image, the story the mind creates about what has happened. And they understood that the impression is not the same as reality. What actually happened is fixed. It is over. But the impression, the story, is entirely in your control. You can examine it, question it, revise it, or most powerfully release it. Epictetus taught, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." Not the event. The opinion about the event. The story. The meaning you have attached to it. Change the story, not to deny the pain, but to stop letting a narrative you constructed be the thing that runs your life. Let me tell you about a man named Adise. Adise, a woman, despite the name her family had chosen, had been passed over for a promotion she had earned every qualification for. A less experienced colleague received it instead, and the reasons given were vague and institutional and unconvincing. She knew what had happened. She felt it in her body. And she was right. But Adise spent the next 2 years living inside the story of what had happened more than she lived inside her actual life. She talked about it constantly to friends, to family, to herself in the mirror at 6 in the morning. She replayed every performance review, every interaction with the decision makers, every meeting where she had been brilliant and had somehow still not been seen. The story was real. The injustice was real. And the story was also slowly eating her alive. A mentor finally said something that landed. "You were wronged. That is true. And the person who is wronging you now is you, by keeping yourself in that room, replaying that decision, while your actual life is happening somewhere else." Adise did not need to forgive the institution. She did not need to pretend the injustice hadn't happened. What she needed to do, what the Stoics would have advised, was release the story's grip on her present. To say, "This happened. I did not deserve it. I am not going to let it define every day that comes after it." She left the company. She started over somewhere new. And she carried with her not bitterness but something the Stoics would have recognized, the hard-won wisdom of someone who had been tested, who had been found to be more than what was done to them, and who had decided clearly and finally that the story of the wrong was not the most interesting story she had to live. Release the story? Not to protect the people who wrote it. To free yourself from the prison of living in it. Point 4. Starting over is not starting from zero. Everything you've lived is still with you. Here is the lie that stops people from starting over. The lie says, if you leave, you lose everything. All the years, the effort, the investment, the identity, it disappears. Starting over means going back to the beginning, to nothing, to zero. And who wants to do that? Who wants to stand at the bottom of another mountain when they have already climbed so far up this one? This is not true. And the Stoics understood precisely why it is not true. Everything you have done, every difficulty you have survived, every skill you have built, every lesson you have learned from every mistake you have made, none of that leaves with the thing you are releasing. It lives in you. It has become you. The company may close, but the businessman who built it carries every skill forward. The relationship may end, but the person who loved in it carries the capacity, the depth, the understanding of themselves that only that experience could have produced. Marcus Aurelius lost campaigns he had planned carefully. He lost people he loved. He lost years to illness and to the obligations of rule that kept him from the philosophical life he genuinely preferred. And he never described any of it as starting from zero. He described it as the accumulation of material. The obstacle is the way. Everything that happened was data. Everything that happened made him more of what he needed to be for what came next. Here is the story. There was a woman named Blessing who had spent 8 years building a restaurant. Everything she had, her savings, her parents' loans, her 20s, the best years of her energy and creativity went into that restaurant. And then, through a combination of rising costs, a changing neighborhood, and one catastrophic year of compounding problems, the restaurant closed. People who knew her expected devastation. Some of it came. She grieved. She sat with the loss honestly, because the Stoics never taught that you should pretend not to feel things. only that you should not be ruled by what you feel. And then she looked at what she actually had. 8 years of understanding what customers wanted before they could articulate it. 8 years of supply chain knowledge, of managing people under pressure, of solving problems that had no textbook solutions. 8 years of learning what worked and, more valuable, what didn't. 8 years of relationships with suppliers, staff, and regulars who trusted her completely. She had not lost 8 years. She had become 8 years. She had been built by them. Within 3 years, she opened something new. Smaller. Smarter. Built with the wisdom that only failing at something honestly can give you. And it thrived in the way that the first restaurant, begun without that wisdom, never could have. She told a journalist, "People kept saying I was starting over. But I was not starting over. I was starting better. There is no version of what I built the second time that exists without everything the first time taught me. When you let go and start again, you do not go back to zero. You go forward, carrying everything you are, everything you have learned, everything failure and loss and time have built inside you. The only thing you leave behind is what no longer fits. That is not starting over. That is arriving." Point 5. Stop explaining yourself to people who are never going to understand. The Stoic practice of inner authority. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that belongs only to people who have been trying, for months, or years, or sometimes a lifetime, to make someone understand them who has decided not to. Not someone who cannot understand. Someone who has decided not to. And yet the effort continues. The explanations get longer, more detailed, more carefully structured. The evidence mounts. The conversations circle the same ground again and again, each time slightly differently worded, in the hope that this time, the framing will be the one that finally lands. It never lands. And the person doing the explaining slowly loses something they may not even have a name for, their inner authority. Their sense that their reality is valid whether or not it is confirmed by the person across from them. Their ability to know what they know without needing another person's recognition of it to make it real. The Stoics called this hegemonic in the governing faculty, the ruling part of the self. The part that knows. That sees clearly. That does not require outside validation to trust its own perceptions. Epictetus was emphatic about this. He said the person who needs others to agree with them in order to feel confident in their own reality has given away their most important possession. And the path back to themselves runs directly through the practice of releasing the need to be understood by people who are not trying to understand them. Here is the story. There was a man named Uluwasian who had spent 3 years in a difficult family dynamic. A parent who consistently reframed events in ways that made Uluwasian doubt his own memory and perception. Every conversation about the relationship ended with Uluwasian feeling confused, guilty, and somehow responsible for things he had not done. Every attempt to explain how he experienced the dynamic was met with an alternative version of reality so confidently presented that he began to question his own. He went to a therapist. The therapist listened to several months of these described conversations and said something simple that changed everything. "You keep trying to get him to confirm your reality. What if your reality doesn't need his confirmation?" Uluwasian sat with that for a long time. He realized the explaining was not really for his parent who was never going to agree. The explaining was for himself. He was trying to use his parents' agreement as proof that what he experienced was real. And as long as that proof was withheld, he kept going back. Kept trying. Kept making the case. He stopped making the case. Not in anger. Not dramatically. He simply, gradually, with enormous effort, stopped needing the verdict. He knew what had happened. He knew how it had felt. He knew what he needed. And he began to build his life around that knowing, without waiting for it to be ratified. The freedom was not immediate. But it was real. And it grew, every week that he lived from his own inner authority rather than reaching outside himself for permission to trust his own perception. Stop explaining yourself to people who are not trying to understand you. Your reality does not require their agreement to be real. Know what you know. And let the knowing be enough. Point 6. Grieve the loss honestly. You cannot truly let go of what you have never truly mourned. Here is where the Stoic path diverges most sharply from what most people expect. People expect the Stoics to say, feel nothing. Move on immediately. Suppress the grief, the loss, the pain. Be strong, which means be emotionless. Detach and proceed. That is not what the Stoics said. That is not what the Stoics practiced. And it is not what actually works. The Stoics understood with remarkable psychological precision for their time that grief is not weakness. It is the appropriate and necessary response of a human being to the loss of something real. Attempting to suppress it or deny it does not eliminate it. It only drives it underground, where it does its damage in the dark rather than in the open. What the Stoics taught was not the absence of grief, but the quality of grief. Grieve the thing honestly. Sit with the loss fully. Do not perform tragedy for an audience, and do not perform strength for one either. Simply in private, in real terms, let yourself feel the weight of what has ended. And then, having felt it fully and honestly, choose what comes next. Marcus Aurelius grieved. He lost children. He lost his closest advisor and friend, Fronto. He wrote about loss with a tenderness that contradicts every caricature of Stoic coldness. He grieved, and then he returned to his work, his philosophy, his duty. Not because the grief was gone, but because he had met it fully and it had not destroyed him. Here is the story. There was a woman named Zara who ended a 6-year relationship. A relationship that needed to end, that she knew needed to end, and that she had finally found the clarity and the courage to end. And then she did not let herself be sad about it. She had decided, consciously, that because the relationship needed to end, because it was the right decision, because she had been the one to make it, she was not entitled to grief. She threw herself into work, into new plans, into reinvention. She talked to everyone about the exciting next chapter and did not give herself a single afternoon to sit with the loss of a person she had loved deeply for 6 years. For 8 months this worked. On the surface. Then, without warning or obvious cause, she collapsed not physically but emotionally. Everything she had not let herself feel arrived all at once. The grief, the sadness, the missing of a person even while knowing the relationship was wrong, the mourning of a future she had once believed in and had now released it came without warning in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday and was completely overwhelming. She finally sat with it. She cried for days in a way she had not allowed herself to do in 8 months. And when it passed, when she had actually moved through it rather than around it, she found on the other side a lightness she had not expected. Real release. The kind that only comes from having genuinely felt what you are releasing. Grieve honestly. Not forever. Not as a performance. But as the real, human acknowledgement that something that mattered has ended. That is not weakness. That is the Stoic completion of loss, the full cycle that makes genuine starting over possible. You cannot truly begin a new chapter if you have not read the last page of the old one. Feel it. Then close the book. Point 7. Cut contact with your former self. The person you were is not the person you are becoming. There is a less obvious thing that needs to be released when you let go of a situation, a relationship, or a chapter of your life. Not just the external thing. The internal version of yourself that was built inside that situation. The identity that formed around it. The beliefs about yourself that were shaped by it. The limitations you absorbed from it and began to call your own. Every significant relationship, every long chapter of life, every environment we inhabit for a period of time, they shape us. They tell us things about ourselves. Some of those things are true and useful and worth keeping. Others are the stories that specific situations needed us to believe in order to maintain the dynamic. And when the situation ends, those stories need to end too. The Stoics were deeply attentive to this. They understood that the self is not fixed. That we are constantly shaped by what we give our time and attention to, which means we can also choose to be shaped by something different. To decide deliberately that the identity built in the old chapter does not need to travel into the new one. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, began his philosophical life as a merchant. When his ship sank and he lost everything, He wandered into a bookshop in Athens and began reading Socrates. Something in him recognized that the merchant's identity, which circumstance had now removed, was not the only identity available to him. He had the freedom to become something entirely different. He became the founder of one of the most enduring philosophical traditions the world has ever produced. Not despite losing his merchant identity. Because of it. Here is the story. There was a man named Emeka who had spent 15 years in a marriage that for most of those 15 years had quietly communicated to him that he was not enough. Not cruel communication. Not dramatic. Just the persistent, ambient message of a relationship where he was consistently the one apologizing, consistently the one adjusting, consistently the one made to feel that his instincts, desires, and ways of being in the world were slightly wrong. He absorbed it. Over 15 years, he absorbed it so completely that he stopped being able to distinguish between what he actually thought and felt and wanted, and what the relationship had trained him to think and feel and want. When the marriage ended, he expected to feel free. Instead, he felt lost. Because the person he had built inside the marriage, the self-doubting, constantly adjusting, seeking permission version of himself, was the only self he could clearly locate. He began working with a therapist and reading philosophy. And slowly, very slowly, he began the process of identifying the beliefs he had absorbed that were not his own. I am too much. Not his belief, it was handed to him. My instincts are usually wrong. Not his belief, it was repeated to him until he forgot it was someone else's opinion. I need to earn the right to take up space. Not his belief, but 15 years of a certain dynamic had made it feel like truth. He released these one by one. Not all at once. But deliberately, over time, he let the old self dissolve, not because that self was worthless, but because it had been built inside a specific situation that no longer existed. What emerged was someone who surprised him. Someone quieter in some ways, louder in others. Someone with preferences he had forgotten he had. Someone who took up space without apology. Someone his friends said seemed finally like himself. You are allowed to leave behind the version of yourself that was built inside the thing you are releasing. That version served a purpose. It kept you functional inside a specific context. But the context is ending. And you are permitted, encouraged, in fact, to let the self that was built for it dissolve along with it. Step into the new chapter as someone who is still being made. That is not instability. That is the highest form of Stoic self-cultivation, the willingness to be continuously rebuilt by experience, always in the direction of who you actually are. Point 8. Do not announce your new beginning, let it speak for itself. One of the most consistent mistakes people make when they are starting over is the announcement. The social media post about the new chapter. The conversation where they tell everyone about the changes they are making. The declaration, sometimes inspiring, sometimes performing, about who they are becoming and what they are leaving behind. The Stoics were deeply skeptical of this impulse. Not because sharing is wrong, but because the announcement, the public declaration of the transformation, almost always precedes the actual transformation rather than following from it. And in preceding it, it often replaces it. There is psychological research that confirms what the Stoics intuited. When we tell people about our intentions, the brain experiences a premature sense of completion. The telling feels like the doing. The declaration gives us the social reward, the attention, the support, the recognition that we were supposed to be working toward. And having received it early, we have less energy and less motivation for the actual work of becoming. Marcus Aurelius never announced his meditations. He never published them. He wrote them for himself, in private, and they were found after his death. The most famous personal development journal in human history was never meant to be seen. Because it was not for anyone else. It was the actual work, not the performance of the work. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Do not perform your growth for the crowd. Do the growth in private, in silence, in the unglamorous work of daily discipline. And let the evidence of the change eventually be so undeniable that it speaks for itself. Here is the story. There was a woman named Fatu who had left a difficult situation, a toxic workplace, with enormous energy and enormous plans. She told everyone. Her social media became a record of the new chapter, the new morning routines, the new goals, the new reading, the new version of herself that was emerging from the difficulty she had survived. For the first 3 months, the response was wonderful. People liked her posts, sent messages of support, told her she was inspiring. And Fatu, who had been genuinely struggling inside the workplace situation, felt for the first time in a long time like she was being seen and valued. Then the energy ran out. The posts slowed. The routines she had announced became harder to maintain without the audience to perform them for. The new chapter, which had been so publicly declared, had somehow never fully begun because the performance of it had been mistaken for the thing itself. She talked to an older woman she respected, someone who had rebuilt her own life twice and done it quietly. The woman listened and then said, "Stop talking about who you are becoming. Become her. Then, when you have become her, you will not need to announce it. Everyone will already know." Fatu went quiet. She deleted the posts about the new chapter. She stopped telling people what she was working on. She just worked. Every morning, with no audience. Every week, without checking whether anyone was watching. A year later, she was entirely different. Not in the ways she had announced. The announced version had been a performance of transformation rather than the real thing. In quieter, deeper ways. Ways that people who knew her noticed before she said a word about it. Do your transformation in private. Work in the silence. Let the evidence accumulate. And when the time comes when people ask what changed, you can tell them. But the telling will be the end of the story, not the beginning of it. Point 9. The Stoic art of beginning again with nothing to prove. Here is the thing that makes starting over feel most threatening. Not the practical difficulty. Not the uncertainty. Not the fear of failure. The ego. The part of you that says, I was someone. I had built something. I had a reputation, a position, a place in the hierarchy of things. And now I am beginning again, which means I am, by some social measure, behind. Which means people who know where I was will see where I am now and draw conclusions about what happened in between. The Stoics had a direct prescription for this particular form of suffering. Release the attachment to what other people think your trajectory should look like. Because the person who begins again with nothing to prove, who genuinely does not need the new chapter to vindicate the old one, is the freest person in the room. They are not managing optics. They are not making decisions based on how they will look. They are not holding themselves back from the right move because the right move seems like a step backward and stepping backward seems like admitting defeat. They are just building. Honestly. From where they actually are rather than from where they wish they appeared to be. Seneca wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that they are difficult." The biggest obstacle to beginning again is almost never practical. It is the unwillingness to be seen in the early stages, to be a beginner again, to not know things, to be imperfect in public, to have a story that includes a fall before it includes a rise. Here is the story. There was a man named Ikechukwu who had been, for 10 years, at the top of his industry. A senior executive. Known. Respected. Sought after. His name on reports that people read. His opinion in rooms that mattered. A restructuring removed the position. Not his choice. Not his failure. Just the indifferent mechanism of corporate change, which cares nothing for the decade of excellence preceding it. He was offered a position 2 levels below what he had held. By any traditional measure of career trajectory, it was a step backward. The optics were clear. People would see. People would talk. He took the position. Not because he had no other choice, he had other choices. He took it because the work genuinely interested him, because the company had values he respected, and because the Stoic logic was simple. If the work is right and the life it builds is right, the level on the organizational chart is a preferred indifferent. Fine to care about in the abstract. Not worth compromising the actual living of your life. He showed up on his first day in the new role with the same quality of attention, the same depth of thinking, the same commitment to doing excellent work that he had brought to the senior position. Without the senior title, without the recognition that came with it, without any visible anxiety about the gap between where he had been and where he was. Within 18 months, he had been promoted twice. Not because he was performing his lack of ego. Because when you genuinely release the need to prove something, you free up enormous amounts of energy that had been going toward the performance. And that energy goes straight back into the actual work. Begin again with nothing to prove. The freedom of that is not a consolation prize. It is the most powerful position available to a human being, the one with nothing to protect and everything to build. Point 10. Silence is the sound of someone who has already decided, and that decision is everything. We come back, finally, to where we began. Because everything we have traveled through, the releasing, the grieving, the letting go of old stories and old selves and the need for validation and the anxiety of appearances, it all arrives at the same place. A decision. Made quietly. With no audience. The Stoics understood that the most significant moments in a human life are almost never dramatic. They are internal. They are the moment private, unglamorous, often unremarkable in appearance when a person decides with their whole self that something is over. Or that something is beginning. Or that they are no longer willing to be what circumstances have made of them and are choosing, from this day forward, to become what they actually intend to be. No announcement. No ceremony. No one watching. Just the decision. And then the living of it. Zeno decided in a bookshop in Athens. His ship had sunk. He was reading about Socrates. And something clicked, not loudly, not dramatically, and a merchant became a philosopher. The decision happened in a moment. The living of it took the rest of his life. Marcus Aurelius decided every morning at his desk before the empire woke. The decision was to be a good man first and an emperor second, to govern from philosophy rather than from ego. That decision was made in silence, in private, in handwriting that was never meant to be read. And that decision shaped the most powerful position in the ancient world. Epictetus decided, in chains, in pain, in the complete absence of external freedom, that his mind belonged to no one who did not have his permission. That decision cost him nothing material, because he had nothing material. And it gave him something that his wealthy, powerful, free contemporaries would never have, the sovereignty of a self that could not be touched. Here is the final story. There was a woman, let's call her Ada, who had spent the better part of 4 years trying to decide. About a relationship that was hurting her. About a career that had stopped fitting who she had become. About a version of herself she had outgrown but kept wearing because it was familiar, and because changing felt like too much, and because what would people say, and what would she do on the other side, and what if she was wrong? 4 years of trying to decide. And then one morning, an ordinary morning, nothing special about it, no dramatic catalyst, no final straw, she simply decided. Not loudly. She did not tell anyone. She did not post about it. She did not call her closest friend to process it. She sat with her coffee in the early morning light and she felt, for the first time in 4 years, the specific and unmistakable sensation of clarity. Of having chosen. Of the choosing being done. She began that same day to make the small, practical moves that the decision required. Not rushing. Not performing. Just moving, steadily, quietly, with the calm certainty of someone who is no longer deciding. Within a year, the life she was living looked almost nothing like the life she had been living the morning of the decision. And she said that the strangest part was that no one who knew her casually would have been able to identify the exact moment when everything changed. There was no moment visible from the outside. There was only a woman who had decided, in silence, for herself, with no one watching, and then simply lived the decision, one day after another, until the life she had chosen and the life she was living were finally the same thing. That is how you take your power back. Not with noise. Not with a final speech or a dramatic exit or a public declaration. With a decision, quiet, total, completely your own, to let go of what is finished and begin, in silence, the only life that was ever really yours to live. Somewhere right now, There is a person holding on to something they know needs to be released. Maybe it is a relationship. Maybe it is a chapter of work. Maybe it is a version of themselves that no longer fits. Maybe it is a story about what happened to them that they have told so many times it has become more real than the actual life happening around it. And they are holding on because letting go feels like losing. Because starting over feels like admitting defeat. Because the silence on the other side of the decision feels emptier than the noise inside the thing they are in. The Stoics would sit with that person and say, "You are not afraid of what you are losing. You are afraid of who you will be without it. And who you will be without it is the only person who can live the rest of your life." Let go. In silence. Not because it is easy. Not because it will not hurt. But because the life that is waiting for you on the other side of that decision is not the consolation prize for the life you thought you were going to have. It is the real one. The most powerful thing you will ever do is walk away without saying a word. And then build quietly, deliberately, completely on your own terms something that silence alone could never have given you. If this reached something in you, share it with someone who needs permission to begin again.